Hello and welcome to this evening's event. My name is Francesca Stocco and I'm a researcher at Nottingham Trent University. My research specializes on the sociology of the art market, and I look at the recent resurgence of textile art in the contemporary art space. And so it's an absolute pleasure to be here in conversation with Aziza Kadyri. Hi, Aziza. And Aziza's practice blends the Central Asian tradition of suzani embroidery with AI technology. But before I introduce Aziza properly, I would like to mention that this event is part of a series of public events called Formations, led by the Postcolonial and Global Studies Research Group at Nottingham Trent University, and it is hosted by the Bonington Gallery. This conversation will last around an hour, and you're very welcome to post any questions you may have in the YouTube chat or by sending an email to formations@ntu.ac.uk, and we will address all your questions towards the end of the conversations. Now, to introduce tonight's speaker, Aziza Kadyri is a multidisciplinary artist focusing on experimental costumes, textiles, performance practices, and immersive technology. Her work has been showcased at the Uzbekistan National Pavilion at the 60th Venice Biennial, Pushkin House in London, Fondazione Elpis in Milan, and Kindle, Center for Contemporary Art in Berlin, among, I suppose, many other locations. And this year, she will participate in the first edition of the Bukhara Biennial and the 5th Hangzhou Triennial of Fiber Art, which I'm really looking forward to knowing more about. So just to jump into this conversation, I think we met last year, Aziza, probably around this time at the opening of the Uzbekistan Pavilion in Venice, and I thought we could start from there, from the pavilion, and which was a major event for your career as an artist. And I was wondering if you can talk about the pavilion and also you describe your decision to present the work that you've done, not as a single artist, but as a collective with Qizlar.
That is a massive question, by the way. But thank you, Francesca, for introducing me. And I actually just realized it's 16th of April, which actually exactly a year ago the pavilion opened.
Oh wow!
On the 16th of April 2024, which was the first day of the preview. So it's a bit of a full circle moment.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I just was thinking about it while I was preparing the talk. Yeah.
Yeah. So we probably literally met exactly a year ago.
Yeah.
And it's crazy to think that it's only been a year, but it's already been a year. It's like time doesn't feel real right now. But yeah, the Uzbekistan Pavilion was one of the most incredible things I've done in my professional career so far, obviously. Such an incredible opportunity to just highlight the things I really, really care about. So yeah, thanks to, the Uzbekistan Arts and Culture Foundation for giving this opportunity and trusting the vision, commissioning this work and allowing to represent Uzbekistan. And when I say represent, actually, answering your question about the decision of working collectively, I always, as an artist who is from Uzbekistan historically and kind of in terms of family connections, and ethnically and everything, I'm ethnically Uzbek, but who grew up outside of Uzbekistan, mostly in a very diasporic kind of situation, a migrant that was moving around the entire world. I lived in many different countries growing up. It's really hard to kind of justify for myself, like, do I, even though I have so many like cultural connections and familial connections to a place, to a sort of a culture, do I have the right to represent in some way? So this question always was on my mind, and a lot of my work is kind of built on that as well, and this kind of slightly displaced, detached experience of an immigrant. So when you talk about Uzbekistan Pavilion, it is a structure that is, funded by the state, the government, the cultural institution, and you want to represent the country as well as you can and as faithfully as you can, according to what, you believe the contemporary community is. And because I'm interested in the younger generation, I'm really interested in the generation that was born after 1991, after independence, when the Soviet Union dissolved. And I'm interested to see how this younger generation is kind of coping and dealing with this idea of what is this new Uzbek identity, because Uzbekistan is only 34 years old. How do we define that? This identity that was influenced by so many different things historically. And obviously we also share a lot with, sorry, give me a second. Something just popped up in my laptop. Yeah, we share a lot with the neighboring countries, because also, the borders were always changing, ever changing, and not, very voluntarily by the people who live there. And the Islamic influences, the influences of the Soviet rule, and how do we deal with that, right? And so it was important to me to have a variety of voices in the pavilion, because it didn't feel right to do something on my own. Because also, secondly, here's my second point, I have always worked collaboratively, and collaboration is really one of the main pillars of my practice. And I'm interested in the process of collaboration as much as in the output of the collaboration. Maybe that comes from, my background in performance and theater design, where, to produce something on a stage or something, to produce a film as well, because I worked a bit in short films. Mm-hmm. You have to have a huge team of people, everyone collaborating and making sure that things run smoothly, but everyone's voice is also represented, and so on. So I'm interested in collaboration, and co-founding Qizlar Collective in Uzbekistan was one of these manifestations of this interest and this desire to organize together in order to bring positive change as much as we can. Because I'm also quite interested in activism and like socially engaged work. So having already kind of participated in this socially engaged work in Uzbekistan through Qizlar Collective, with my colleagues and my friends, the girls who are also part of the collective, it all, like everything I just said, sort of naturally came together. And I felt that inviting part of the collective to come join and participate in the pavilion and in the research and the making of the artworks, and involving the even wider community of people that we already work with, mm-hmm. Was the most logical thing to do. And I wouldn't have been able to do anything else in a way, because it was just literally the representation of my connection with Uzbekistan, and how, because I haven't lived in Uzbekistan for how many years? 20-something years. Through these connections with Qizlar, I was able to feel like I'm welcome back. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So I felt really welcomed and accepted. And, in a way, this is really my experience of, living in Uzbekistan for a short time, but also working there and keeping these connections. It's all about this network, and thinking, asking the questions together and looking for answers together, because this is what we're doing and this is what we continue doing. So, none of the stuff in the pavilion was sort of created only for the pavilion and suddenly kind of conjured out of thin air. Everything that we showed was something that we already have been researching, working on. This is just a natural kind of continuation of our interests.
Yeah, maybe we can show some images of the pavilion so that people following us can have an idea of what we are talking about. I remember entering the pavilion, it was quite dark, all these blue textiles coming down, but also you would have multiple artworks. You have costumes from theater performance, you have suzani, handmade suzani next to videos showcasing the interpretation of suzani by an AI software. And then
Yeah.
I remember the sort of surprise effect at the very end of the pavilion where all of a sudden visitors were up on stage. And remember you said something to me in one of our previous conversations that you feel that a sort of collective pavilion was a better representation of Central Asian art practice. So I was wondering
Yeah.
if you can elaborate on that.
It's great that you asked this because I was just like, oh, I forgot to talk about Madina. So another kind of manifestation, I guess, of collectivity in the pavilion is working with the wonderful artisans. Because, most of the work was created collectively, and especially the embroideries and the sort of patchwork. Everything that was patchworked and embroidered was created in collaboration with Madina Kasimbaeva and her team, who are incredible artisans who are based in Uzbekistan. And working with artisans is also a part of my practice, also through this interest in collectivity. And working on textiles, especially suzani embroidery, which is a Central Asian type of embroidery that is kind of spread across Tajikistan and Uzbekistan geographically. It's really one of the first manifestations of women's collectivity in our cultures. And every time something is created by hand, it's very often created in a group of women, or either doing separate things or doing one thing together. But this kind of context that was created by coming together and embroidering. And I interviewed Madina about it later after the pavilion opened for the catalog, and we talked about it extensively. And it's still happening. It's still happening where women come together, and it's a chance for them to exchange news, exchange gossip, exchange different wisdoms, and really carry the oral tradition further. Mm-hmm. And that is then reflected in a lot of the embroideries and the patterns that you see. I'm still kind of trying to understand whether it's a direct connection or like a subconscious connection of, when you talk about things and you embroider it, you kind of infuse it with meaning, or the pattern comes through the meaning being formulated in the air. I don't know, but it's something that I'm exploring with this kind of embroidery work that you see.
Yeah. Actually, we can pause, since you mentioned the Suzani embroidery, we can pause on an image of the Suzanis that were just juxtaposed with the screens, sort of reinterpreting the Suzani motifs. And well, I think I will let you describe it. I know it's a bit complex the way the AI software sort of reads the image and then reinterprets it, but I'll let you do the description. But I just wanted also to ask you, going back to the meaning of textile craft. You said, is it something that is embedded in textiles, in the patterns, or is it something that people give while they're making the textiles together? So I was wondering if you could also mention the meaning of textile in your practice and how that evolves and which new meanings it sort of acquires once it's going through the AI process.
Yeah, I don't like painting, so the most obvious medium is out. But I'm joking. There's a lot of reasons why I work with textiles, and I came to these conclusions at different periods of my life. Initially, it was something that my parents sort of sent me to do when I was a kid. So I was like painting, batik. So I was just painting, but on textiles. So I actually grew up, painting and drawing not on paper, but on silk and cotton, which was now I realize is not like a very usual thing to do. And especially, growing up in Moscow as well, Moscow that has a very strong kind of classical tradition of academic painting and so on. And I was doing all these other things that you would associate maybe with not Moscow. And then after, I did fashion design, as I don't know if you mentioned that, for my bachelor's degree. So there was kind of subconscious interest in clothing and like how it affects, the agency of costume, how a piece of clothing can kind of, I guess, become a starting point for either a narrative or shape a character. So you don't shape the character and then put the clothing, but it works the other way around. So the clothing or the costume informs how the character evolves and so on, which is something that I was interested in. And that's why I kind of transitioned from fashion to costume design, and I worked with performance and theater and everything. And then when I went into my more kind of individual contemporary practice with textiles and not necessarily, making costumes for theater, I was like, why am I so obsessed with textiles? And I realized also growing up, I was constantly surrounded by textiles. My mother, she graduated with a degree in like, um, I don't really know how to say it in English, but it's like textiles and garment construction. And then thinking about that and realizing that actually the entire side of the family that's on my mom's side, they've all been involved in the textile industry in different ways. So my grandmother as well, a lot of my mom's cousins and her brother, they all graduated from the Textile Institute in Tashkent. My grandfather, who we're gonna probably talk about because of one of the works, he was like one of the first members of the Academy of Sciences who specialized in machine engineering specifically for cotton gins and for cotton like refining machines and stuff. So there is a kind of ancestral link in many ways, and then you can unpack that in 100 ways as well. Obviously, like why we're in the textile industry because of the Soviet policies, and you can continue this kind of inquiry into the history of the region. But then coming back to me, why I like textiles is because as a form, it's very kind of flexible and very like it adapts to anything. It can be a flat hanging thing you can put against the wall, but as soon as you take it off, you can shape something completely different from it. And as a form and as an idea, I think I can really relate to it and empathize with it because I've had to adapt to my identity throughout my entire life multiple times. And I always had to be like a piece of textile that is like being remolded into these different shapes. So that's why I kind of like this, rigidity, but also plasticity. So you can pull on it and it very likely will not tear, only if you really like put a lot of pressure. But then it's very soft and adapting. And I think that's why I can relate to it. Like if you humanize a piece of textile, like it would be me.
And so at some point you started to introduce the AI in your work. And so basically, can you describe a little bit how the software works? I understand that it's sort of you built a database of images, and then those images sort of reinterpret, or the software reinterprets the sort of traditional patterns of Suzani, and then some new images come up. And actually, we can play the videos on Suzani's from the pavilion so that people can understand the evolution of the pattern through the software. And
So
you can talk more about the entire software and the work that you've done behind.
I so basically I use a publicly available AI, and there's a reason for it. So I use an AI that has been already trained on a specific database that is also publicly available. But the AI allows you to fine tune certain kind of generators. So you can create your own little generator on the base of this, like the 5 billion images that it already has. And you can upload your own images. So I have my own collection that I kind of put together of like images of different Suzani embroideries from different cities across the region. And then that one specific generator within this bigger platform, I then used and like I have conversations with it. I don't like to say, I'm using it. We're like collaborating in a way. Because what happens is I would put in an image in there, and it can be anything. Like specifically in the video that is playing, I think I was putting images of already existing patterns that I sourced from different academic materials, or you know, depending on the aim. I'm not sure what's playing right now. Which one is it? The sewing machines, or yeah. So the sewing machines video, actually, this is one of the this is Madina's embroidery over here. I took an image of a peacock that is it was embroidered on like a historical piece from Nurata, which is a town in the middle of Uzbekistan. And then I was interested in how the AI would interpret it back to me. So what happened is, so I upload an image and I don't give a single word prompt, because I kind of want to honor this idea of a visual language, right? Because I see it as a language, but there aren't really words put on there, and a lot of the meaning is derived through this kind of imagery. So the AI takes the image, and through machine vision, through different ways, it tries to make sense of it and gives me a few outputs that are an interpretation of what it saw within the style of embroidery that I trained it on. And then this is where the conversation starts, because, you know, it's offering me a possibility. And then out of the many outputs, I pick one that I like. So, you know, I have agency as much as the AI does. And I take that image and I manipulate it a little bit further. So I then interpret the result of the AI. And that interpreted images I put back, and there's like a feedback loop. And through that feedback loop, you get like a sequence of thousands of images. And then to create this video, because this video is not AI generated, it's me editing all of these images then in like Premiere Pro or something. There are some AI transitions and stuff, and obviously there's like a bunch of, I think each version of the image has like, I don't know, maybe 50 like slightly different versions of it. So yeah, this is how the conversation happens. And what is interesting to me is that in the process of this feedback loop, I started to see how this bigger database of 5 billion images was influencing the results that I wanted to get. And this is where the actual research kicked in. Because, you know, obviously the pieces in the pavilion, those were not the first pieces I made, and not the first pieces and the sequences. There was a lot of other things that I was doing before. It's just not shown in the same way. So the research was, you know, looking at AI then as a mirror of cultural bias, as something that, you know, uses a database that was put together by a very specific group of people. I think it was somewhere in Germany. You know, those 5 billion images, it is a sort of an archive. And how do you then, through this kind of interaction, see how the machine archive replicates erasure, replicates, you know, misconceptions and biases that exist between cultures? You know, there's the dominant culture, and there's, like, let's say, the global South.
Can you give an example of? Can you give an example of that sort of bias? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was another video, and I don't know if we're gonna play it, but the one with the teapots and like the Coca-Cola bottles.
No, we did not add it to the stream.
You can, I think, go on my website. I think I have the video there, somewhere. This is for the audience. But there was a sequence where I put in images from a real embroidery that was done kind of in the middle of the last century, so already in the Soviet times. And it's from a specific town kind of next to Samarkand, and they embroidered these little teapots, which are already like a European intervention into the sort of domestic culture of Central Asia. And the AI took the image and it recognized the teapot, but then the further we went, the more the kind of, you know, sort of homeware and the teapots and the cups and everything started to become more and more Western looking, as if suddenly it was pulling images from like European paintings or photographs or something. And in the end, you know, it became this mocha pot, which is a bit Orientalist, because it's kind of like, oh, a mocha pot is something that looks a little bit exotic, and maybe let's just conflate all the cultures and whatever. And in the end, there was a Coca-Cola bottle. So it started like hallucinating things on the subject of these, vessels where you what a good receptacles for drinks. And then it started like just showing these more contemporary or more Western concepts, but still in the style of an embroidery, in the style and in the visual kind of element of Suzani embroidery. And it's just one example. I think a more obvious example would be the work that I do with self-exotization archives, in terms of bias, because that's what I usually show when I do talks, for example, on the subject.
Yeah. Actually, we can move into the other work that we wanted to discuss about. So I think actually, here we're always talking about ornaments from the Suzani cloth, embroidered cloth. And we're always talking about the use of AI. But in this case, the protagonist is you. So you basically sort of use patterns from the Suzanis and then project them on your portrait, essentially. And at the beginning, when I saw that work, I really thought it was sort of a critique towards the concept of Orientalism, which is a concept formalized by Edward Said, and it's about the representation of the Western representation of the so-called Orient, which could also be interpreted as sort of narrative within imperialist or colonialist agendas. I'm thinking about, for example, the Russian Empire or even the Soviet Union towards maybe Central Asian regions. But in your case, so I think there's the element of critique towards imperial power, but it's also a reflection on your own identity as a person who grew up not in Uzbekistan. So can you talk about the sort of becoming, I mean, you're critiquing the ornament aspect, but you're also becoming a sort of Suzani work yourself. So can you talk about that?
I think this is one of the first works where I kind of realized that I'm really interested in this idea of like trickstering and like tricksterism, which obviously is quite resonant when you talk about being an immigrant, a migrant from the global South in the West, especially where you have to constantly do code switching and shape shifting and all of that. And yeah, you're right. There is absolutely this kind of critique of exoticization. That's why it's called exoticization, and Orientalism and how women and their art, especially, is seen within the context that I exist right now. And as I mentioned before as well, not just me, but a lot of women artists from Central Asia, they're facing these kind of very interesting issues where if they're not being exoticized, then they're accused of self-exoticizing. Because they chose to work with the visual language and with the heritage that was, very rightfully passed down to them by their mothers and grandmothers and so on. But because let's say, for the so-called Western gaze, it looks very ornamental, it looks very colorful. Some people use the word, primitive, which is, I stop talking to people when they say that. Or like ethnic art and so on. So there's a lot of othering happening from both sides. There's othering happening, obviously, as I said, orientalizing from the outsider's gaze, but also from the inside. Very often I do get things like, oh, you're self-exoticizing, why are you doing this? Which is a very strange kind of idea to have. And I've had these conversations with my peers from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And yeah, the answer is just kind of, I guess, exist as a trickster within these two. And the videos that I made were this kind of attempt to I don't want to say make fun of it, but kind of just illustrate the situation we're in and I'm in, and also the need to kind of constantly change. So obviously in the performance video, like the video where I am actually in it, it's a lot of different interpretations of my own face by the AI. So I put my face into the AI, and it gave me all these different options, which again, I sometimes when I do talks about AI, I show the example of the AI sort of being still quite Western leaning, or like leaning towards the, let's say, European tradition of painting, for example, because that's just the images that it was trained on, or like it has a better knowledge of. So when I would upload my face, it would recognize that it is a face of a woman, and then in the response that it gives me, it renders usually the AI sort of idea of a generic woman who has blue eyes and has light hair. So I would say 80% of the time that would be the case, and then 15% of the time it would be a woman who's more kind of Middle Eastern looking, but I would say maybe more like, you know, leaning towards Lebanon or you know, Syria type face, and not as sort of Central Asian as mine is. So yeah, I think help me get back into the get back to my point.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering about,
Yeah.
you know, how it was also very much a reflection of your identity. But I also wonder how much, you know, I also, to be honest, I was following the flow of your speech, and one, so I got lost as well.
Yeah.
But one thing that came to mind is how much maybe, you know, contemporary art museums, now there's this kind of necessity to make sure that the contemporary art sphere is quite global. So sometimes I also have the feeling that the idea of embedding sort of craft elements in the art could also potentially be a sort of a check marks for institution to say, hey, we actually have a very sort of global outlook on art, and sort of incorporate, you know, we are beyond the art and craft divide and so on. Do you feel that the ornamental aspect, I know you're critiquing it, but do you think that the way you work with craft is being sort of potentially instrumentalized by, you know, in sort of in the contemporary art discourse, or did you have any critique about it?
I don't feel that. If anything, I feel that I'm still quite outside of what a lot of the institutions prefer to show. This is how I feel. But I mean, there is interest towards my work, and I'm really happy about it. I'm not complaining about it. But there is always a concern a bit like, oh, what I'm showing is quite kind of colorful and really into your face. But it is what I'm interested in, and I'm really faithful to my own research and my own interest. None of the ornaments, let's say, or like the visual language that I have adopted didn't come from like nowhere. So the reason, for example, so I started working with embroidery with the nine moons piece, which only happened because the starting point was a piece of embroidery that was my great grandmother's dowry. And the work was about, you know, how there was this huge, beautiful embroidery, and then it was cut into pieces by the different parts of my family, sort of taken apart. And now half of it, we don't even know where it is. And we have these two pieces that I then recreated. And then the form was really dictated by the original piece. Before that, I wasn't really working with embroidery. And yeah, the whole visual language of it is coming from my own research of, like, again, the visual language of embroidery, how it really contains so much information. It's really, especially the embroideries that, you know, were made before the Soviet rule. They're really historical documents that first of all, very often were the only representation of a woman and her interests and her hopes and dreams that could be seen by the outside world. Because obviously, you know, women, mostly in families that had a bit more money, they would be hidden from the world. You know, they would wear a paranja, a chachvan. They wouldn't really leave the sort of part of the courtyard and the house where, you know, only women were allowed to be. So, you know, an embroidery very, very often was a representation of a woman. and her identity. So the one that she made herself. And then, but going even further back, there's a lot of historical research, obviously, on the patterns and how it really shows the religious syncretism of the region. There's influences from the like astral beliefs that predate Islam and even Zoroastrianism. So you have that. We have then Zoroastrian things, and then we have, very clearly we could see the Islamic influence, with the Arab conquest, when a lot of the symbols have become more floral, have become more kind of ornamental in the sense that, they are right now. And then regionally, you can also see, so geographically, if the more north you go in Uzbekistan and closer to the steppes, the more kind of geometric the embroideries become, because the very strong kind of astral beliefs and imagery, they were still remaining more strongly in the consciousness. So in Tashkent, you have these huge like red circles, and that's pretty much red circles and stars. So like moons and stars. But then in Bukhara, for example, it's very floral, a lot of like even little fish and animals that you could see embroidered. So because Bukhara used to be one of the places, where the court was. So it was influenced way more by Islamic tradition and by sort of Persian culture. So yeah, all of this, my point is like all of this ornamental language is not, I'm not doing this because it's pretty. It is pretty, but I'm mainly interested in the history and the kind of language that is embedded in it.
Yeah. And sorry, there's a bit of background noise. You mentioned the role of the woman in relation to Suzani, and I want to shift to another work of yours titled Her Stage. And in this case, it's quite a personal story because you're inspired by your grandmother's story, who, correct me if I say anything wrong, but she was a traditional folk dancer in Uzbekistan, but she couldn't sort of follow her dream because her family was not supporting her. So here we're talking about potentially, patriarchal system. And I think it's quite interesting. I mean, we're not able to show the video that you've done, but I think we can show some images related to this work. And yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the story behind this work.
So a lot of the work that I do right now is connected to family, because in many ways, it's a way for me to kind of reconnect with those stories that I was never exposed to, unfortunately. And a lot of digging right now, like, my grandmother, she's alive and well, and every time I visit her, which is 3-4 times a year in Uzbekistan, I try to have as many conversations with her as possible, to kind of just learn not just only about herself, but about the kind of extended family. And it's a way for me to understand myself as well, why I am the way I am. I was having a conversation yesterday with somebody, and I was saying, oh, I'm the only artist in the family right now. Everyone else has been a scientist or an engineer or different things. Where is this coming from? Why am I an artist? And I realized through a lot of these conversations that actually there was so much creativity flowing in the family, but it just never found the outlet for the reasons that you mentioned, and the different kind of aspirations that existed in the Soviet times, specifically in the circles that my family was in. Being an artist was not something that was fun or prestigious to do, or really realistic. So the story of my grandmother is one of those stories. And she never was a folk dancer. She studied folk dancing, and she was really extremely good at it. And she still is. She's 85 years old, soon to be 86. And when she tells me stories, she like illustrates them with little dances.
So can I ask you, in the video, again, we cannot show it, but in the video, are you talking to your grandmother then? Is it her voice?
Yeah.
Oh, that's impressive. Yeah, maybe just a note of that. Yeah, in the video, I had the pleasure like watching it, but I find it quite funny because she had this humor in telling her story, but at the same time, I was smiling while watching this video, but it was kind of a sad smile because, what she
Yeah.
was saying was actually quite brutal. The way she was, she was dancing, but then she was followed by a man. And so her mom has to say, stop going to, whatever dance performance she was doing. Yeah, I was wondering actually, I mean, maybe the personal aspect of it. How did you feel while you were having those conversations?
Yeah, it's always such a revelation. And especially now, I think because now I'm an adult, she's able to talk about things that she never really told anyone. I think maybe that some of the filters are gone as well, because that's not one of this only a little part of a conversation that was much longer. I think the video is only 6 minutes long, right? And maybe the talking part is like 4 minutes, and the conversation was like 70 minutes. So I had to really cut down to the points that were relevant, in some ways, to this work. And in the end as well, you can hear a bit of my voice. You can hear that we're kind of
Yeah,
laughing together.
yeah,
But yeah, this is something that I also understood about myself, because I sort of happen to be this what is it called, like tragical optimist. Even when everything's bad, I'm still optimistic about life, and I got it from, I think, my dad, but my grandmother definitely possesses the same thing, and maybe it's a trauma response in some ways. But yeah, her talking about these things and then having this little laugh afterwards, she always has a little giggle at the end of the sentence, and I left it in because I was like, this is so strange,
yeah.
because she's talking about things that are not very positive, but then she's like, ah, it is what
Mhm.
it is, it is
Yeah,
what it is. And I know that she's had she lived a really long life, and she's still living it. I hope she lives really, really long.
mm,
And she's been successful in many other ways. And she loves talking about that as well. So maybe another work will be about that.
and maybe
Um,
something we can add is that also this probably built also on your background. I mean, you study fashion design in Beijing, and then you did a MA in performance practice and design at Central St.
yeah,
Martin's. So your work is quite performative.
yeah,
Also the way you sort of portray yourself on social media, and now I think this sort of, I call it a deconstructed dancer's costume. The way the work is evolving. I think it sort of builds both on yourself as a person and your family heritage as well. Mm.
yeah. I think it's important to mention that the work also uses. So basically, what happens in the work is that I work with a AI framework that, like, there was a company that helped me build it, AVA Research, and so I worked with a choreographer, a professional choreographer who you see in the video, who listened to the stories of my grandmother and kind of picked existing choreographies, historical choreographies that would resonate with that story, to create a database of movement. So we had a kind of data set of her movements that are professional dance, the things that my grandmother never did because she wasn't allowed to.
Mhm.
And then I had a data set of my grandmother's movements right now, because I wanted to kind of, because now she doesn't really leave the apartment, but she's still very graceful, and she has this very like nice choreography that exists within the space that she's in. So very kind of non-physical restriction in the past has become a physical restriction now. But I wanted to then take her movements right now, and then using AI, like putting them together with the professional choreography, to create this kind of choreography that never happened, or like a
Mhm.
non-existent, like a speculative choreography that can be a little bit broken at sometimes, or deconstructed. But still, I wanted to imagine that this is the choreography that is in her mind at all times. And then the sculptures actually come from different gestures that came out of this kind of new non-existent choreography that
Right.
was created, enabled by AI. So it's an ongoing series. I hope to produce many more gestures. So far, there's two.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, some of them movements are very unnatural. I'm really interested in that kind of, in tracing that movement through sculpture.
Yeah, it's also the reintroduction or reinterpretation with AI of a sort of a intangible, culture. I mean, the dance, which, is sort of a fleeting moment, but you sort of capture it through AI and it goes on repeat for as long as you want. Yeah, that's fascinating. We are going to talk about one last work, which is also about family. But before we do that, I just want to invite anyone who has maybe any question to just take the chance and send them over on YouTube or on the email address, and maybe we'll address them after this last piece of work, which is titled "The Colorado Reminds Me of Sirdaria." And in this case, you draw from your family history, but we're not talking about your grandmother. We're talking about your grandfather, and
Her husband. Her
oh,
husband.
I didn't want to. I didn't want to second
Yeah,
guess. I was like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So your grandfather, and he went during the Cold War. So I mean, during the Soviet times, he went to do a research trip in the U.S. To understand cotton production, right? And so sorry, here we go. And so actually, if we can show some image of that work, I'm not sure if that's, oh, it's already on. Okay, great. And so I understand that you have this installation again with textiles, and embroidered are sort of entries from your grandfather's journal. But what I really want to focus on is the pink suzani, which in this case is not handmade, it's machine embroidered. So I was wondering if you can talk about, this new stream of research. You have a very multifaceted practice, and I think this goes more into the direction of socio-political agendas in Soviet times. But as we also talk again about your family. So yeah, can you talk about this work?
Yeah, it's about my grandpa, who is, the husband of the grandma. And I think it's really cute because both of those works were in Berlin, two different exhibitions at the same time, and it felt like I was kind of bringing them together because my grandfather is no longer alive, unfortunately. But in a way, it's my way to kind of honor his legacy and build these monuments basically for these people that I really admire, that helped create me as well. But yeah, I think in my recent research, I'm leaning more towards looking at, industrialization and industry and how that affects craft, but also how that affects environment, and everything else, social and social environment, and also ecological environment and everything in Central Asia. And it's called "The Colorado Reminds Me of Sirdaria" because it is a quote from my grandfather from his journals that he wrote while he was on this year-long research trip in 1969 as a Soviet researcher in Texas, which was already a unheard of thing to do because Texas, for example, as I found out, was a restricted state for Soviet citizens at the time. You had to get special permission to be there. For many reasons, because first of all, there was the NASA, sort of the main space center in Houston, but also a lot of industry and so on. But he was there, and he was writing a lot about kind of not just the industry, but notes about how the nature and the environment, and how a lot of the things reminded him of Central Asia. So the river, the Colorado River, reminded him of Sirdarya in more ways than one. And then I came to find out that actually there's a second Colorado River in the US. So there's the main one that everyone knows about, and there's a Texas Colorado River that is in Texas. So in the work, I kind of talk about these rivers and the kind of beauty around it, but also the effects of industrialization and exploitation around those rivers. And there's a lot of research going into that, and it's an ongoing project. As a research project, there's going to be the piece that I'm doing for Bukhara is also based on the same kind of research. So I'm trying to find the best way to really represent the plethora of experiences that he had and the conclusions that he made. But also there's a lot of kind of speculation and critical fabulation that I'm putting in as well, because in the piece that I did, the Colorado piece, there was a 35-minute sound spoken word piece as well that was playing at all times. And we wrote a song for it, and the song was written by Jamie Melrose, who was a friend of mine, who read also the translation of those diaries, and then, you know, speculated on how he must have felt, you know, being away from home, being away from the family. And there was a beautiful song written, and we kind of came up with phone calls that he maybe had done, you know, asking about my mother, who was literally just born before he left. So he didn't really see her first year of her life and so on. And they were really close. But yeah, it's coming back to the embroidery, sorry. So the embroidery is something that I found, and I work a lot with salvaged and sort of found textiles, or, you know, vintage textiles that I find, because there's always a story in it. And this one really struck me because when I picked it up, first of all, it was this kind of very interesting imitation of a traditional embroidery that was done with a machine, with like very bright synthetic colors. It had these extra embroideries of the cotton pattern, which is not very traditional, and it really ties into this idea of romanticization of cotton during the Soviet times. But also the fabric itself is really, really weird. So the piece was made probably in 1981 or 82, and you can date that easily because the fabric is a kind of like a jacquard type weave, where it says, you know, glory to the Communist Party, but also it says the 26th Congress of the Communist Party. So you can easily place that in the time. And then besides that, there's like these symbols of, you know, the nuclear symbol, and then a bunch of cotton growing, and then wheat, and a rocket flying to space. So it's really, you know, about in the industry and about all the industrial achievements and agricultural achievements of the Soviet Union, and a big celebration of that. So yeah, the piece kind of then juxtaposes these kind of the simulacra almost of a traditional embroidery, but that was standardized for factory production. So this is a factory produced piece. And the research that my grandfather did, so I was working a lot with the blueprints from his inventions and his patents for the machines that you know, refine cotton. So they're called cotton gins, which is something that was invented in America. And actually, very interestingly, the invention of the cotton gin in the 19th century might have been one of the reasons that actually prolonged slavery in the United States, because it allowed for more effective refinement in cotton. So that's why cotton became more lucrative to make, and that's why they need to make more of it. So slavery lasted longer. So right. You know, it's alleged one of the reasons. So kind of stepping into that territory is also very, like, you have to be very careful and looking at the heritage, also considering, you know, the exploitation that also happened in the Soviet Union and so on. So yeah, looking at it through a more of a personal, familial perspective, I think is a more careful way of doing that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Sorry.
Yeah,
if I may jump in, it's fascinating to understand that the suzani, for me, suzani is a handmade textile tradition. But then during the Soviet times, it was probably limited or forbidden, maybe, I don't know, because it was private work. But then the suzanis still remained as a symbol, but then they were machine made. I don't know to what extent. And then they embedded also, I didn't know that they embedded symbols that I would call almost like pop art. I'm thinking about Dilara Kaipova, who does the ikat with, you know, symbols of like nuclear power plants. And I'm thinking, oh wow, I didn't know that was something that was on.
That specific, what she does specifically wasn't really done. It's I think she's one of the first artists who actually then started incorporating these more contemporary symbols into ikat weaving, which is a different form. I don't work with that yet. But in Suzani, it was more about the kind of cotton buds and cotton balls, or what else? Just very, because when you embroider with a machine, and it looks like a sewing machine, but you know, you just kind of freehand it. And because it's a constant chain, you can't really embroider the same kind of things that you would by hand. So a lot of the language and how you embroider things and how the patterns look had to be changed. So there's now, I don't know, I'm going to show you something actually.
Oh,
So I have this piece that was in Pushkin House, but I'm not going to show you the piece. I'm going to show you the corner of it. I don't know if you can see it, or maybe not very well. But
yeah, sort of like
you
golden
see
thread.
this part. Yeah, but you see this part, for example, where it goes like this is not something that usually is done in handmade embroidery. This flower also quite simplified kind of version of it. So it had to be like streamlined and simplified in order to be machine embroiderable, if that makes sense. So obviously, when you do that, you don't really respect the kind of essence of embroidery, where it is really about, imbuing those images with meanings, and it becomes more ornamental and kind of detached from its original point. And I think what I'm interested in is kind of bringing back this essence of like, really reflecting the world that we see through these images. And I kind of talk about this with Yıldız Muhyiddinova, who's my collaborator, and I talked about this with Madina as well, and how we as artists, artisans can, now use this craft to also reflect our contemporary experiences. And I think the pieces in the pavilion, for example, was just kind of a suggestion of how we can experiment and talk about what we care about now and what we dream about now.
Yeah, that's fascinating because we spoke about this in our previous conversation. You kept sort of the essence of the embroidery, as a sort of medium to convey contemporary thinking and feelings and views of the word. But then I wonder also, and this brings me, we talked about suzani in the Soviet times, but this brings me also to suzani in this very moment as a craft, a traditional craft in Uzbekistan. I was wondering, I think that Uzbekistan is going through a sort of cultural renaissance, at least from the institutional point of view. We have the first Bukhara Biennial curated by Diana Campbell, which will open in September. You're going to participate in that one. We have the Center for Contemporary Art in Tashkent, which is under construction, also due to open in September. And I wonder what is the role of suzani as a craft in this sort of renaissance of arts and culture in Uzbekistan, because I feel a lot of these initiatives bring together different media and different cultural traditions, being food, again, being embroideries, being contemporary art. And I know that maybe the split between craft and art is not, it's something very much European centric, but I think it's quite interesting how everything is sort of blurred. But I also wonder to what extent suzani becomes sort of part of a national identity and also national representation of a country, which is kind of also opening up quite a lot to tourism and again, global contemporary art institutions and so on. I was wondering what were your thoughts on this?
I don't think that suzani kind of stands out amongst other really wonderful crafts and kind of methods of producing cultural objects in Uzbekistan, because there's an incredible tradition of ceramics. There is also ikat weaving, which is massive. In terms of tourism, I guess it's easier to buy and bring back a piece of textile than like a bunch of plates, which are just going to be really heavy. So maybe there's just this idea of convenience, and you can fold it up and then unfold it, and you have a huge thing you can use as a curtain. I don't know, like this. But yeah, there's a lot of really interesting kind of techniques. I don't want to call it like techniques that are also being elevated, also through the Bukhara Biennial, because one of the concepts of the Bukhara Biennial is that all of the artists are working with local artisans in different ways. So we're going to see, gold embroidery, which is very specific to Bukhara, only exists there. We will see, I hope we will see, Iraqi embroidery, which is something that only exists in Shahrisabz. And it's a cross-stitch embroidery. It's not something you see anywhere else in the country. and the different types of ceramics, different types of carpet weaving, and all of that is going to be really elevated. And I think, the state is doing a lot to support. I think, as far as I know, the artisans, because of like the tax release and everything, and giving these opportunities of like, again, as I said, the Power Biennial, the concept is working with artisans, and also everything has to be produced in Uzbekistan, so nobody's actually producing work outside the country. So it's really kind of putting it back into your own economy. But yeah, it has become a part of national identity. I don't want to really, like, national identity is a very weird idea for me. There's I don't have national identity. I have identity, but it's more kind of, it's transnational. It's like transnational. It's not restricted by border, because again, as I said, suzani is not specifically Uzbek. It's actually, spread across the region, and actually even in Uzbekistan, it was always historically mainly made by the Tajik population, the Farsi-speaking population. So, then we have to talk about the multi-ethnic kind of idea of the country, and things that migrate between borders, or like, migrated when there were no border. So yeah, I don't know if I answer.
Yeah, no, it just was what I was quite interested in the fact that yeah, I think there's a lot of these institutional initiatives place a lot of importance on textile traditions, and just make sure that, also the fact that you said that for the Bukhara Biennial, artists have to do work in Uzbekistan, working with artisans, and so I thought it was quite fascinating into how that is being put at the forefront of global initiatives, because obviously the contemporary artist initiatives have a sort of, you have international curators there, and they're set to be quite global in their outlook, but also they want to leverage very local traditions, which I find fascinating and very interesting about what's coming up. Yes.
The point I wanted to make as well is that, the artisans are credited on the same level as artists, which is something that is usually not done. Even if you put crafts in the forefront of an event, very often the crafts people are not credited on the same kind of hierarchy level. But here, even if you go on the website, you see the names of the like invited artists and the artisans all on the same kind of list, and every artwork will have, so it's like an equal collaboration, which I really appreciate, because it's always kind of difficult sometimes with institutions as well to get them to credit the, even the fabricators. And here they're saying, oh, they're not just fabricators, they're actually an active participant, an active kind of creative collaborator, which I really appreciate. Obviously through the lens of my own practice.
Yeah, that's I'm really looking forward to seeing I'm hoping to make it to the Biennial in Bukhara. I think it's going to be a very interesting. I think there's something that was done, for example, in the 1980s in the Biennial of La Habana, or in South Korea. There was this idea of bringing on the same level different sort of professions work in the art world, and also the makers and artisans. But it's obviously, I think it's not something that we see, for example, in other more mainstream, more famous biennials. So yeah, something that I really look forward to seeing. I think we are about to conclude our talk. We've been talking for an hour, so I think we are going to wrap it up shortly. I'm not sure if there are any questions. Nothing coming up, but in case, we're happy to put you in touch with Aziza, and if you email the email that was shared. And I just want to conclude here thanking Alex, who you don't see, but he's been helping us in the background with all the images and videos. and obviously, Aziza, it's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you, and I really look forward to seeing more of your work. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Right. All right. Bye, everyone.